Greetings. Welcome to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagan, and we are back here in Studio 130 for another fun-filled, action-packed episode of the Gold Standard and Iowa Conservative podcasts. Joined here in studio today with everyone's favorite John Hendrickson and Jonathan Williams, our special guest today here in studio. How are you today, Jonathan?
Well, great. Greetings from the land of make-believe out in Washington, D.C. It's good to be back in the Midwest.
I'm sure it is on a cold and blustery March day that's not like the one we've had here lately. But I have to apologize to our listeners and viewers at the front end that you all missed before we went on camera. That joining John and the inability to get the headset on, Jonathan struggled mightily to figure out the special Rubik's Cube combination to get the headset on.
It's a tricky puzzle to put these things on.
It is.
There's a joke somewhere about economists and how many do you need to figure things out, change the light bulb, do headsets.
Guys, just strap in and hang on. We'll get through this together, all right? Before we go on, too many of the introductory pleasantries, you had very nice things to say about Studio 130 here and the operation that we actually have all the, the big kid toys like microphones and soundboards. So I'm glad you're impressed already. But
you guys have a good thing going.
All right. I'm going to try and give you the proper introduction, Jonathan. But you are, and I wrote this down, so if I'm wrong, you have to correct me. You're from ALEC. And we love ALEC here, right? Mm-hmm. Right, John?
That's right.
But that's not Alec Baldwin, right?
No, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the Executive Vice President of Policy, and Chief Economist.
That's right.
Did I nail it?
You nailed it.
Now, a whole bunch of other good stuff, and I'll let you fill in the gaps. But so before we go any further, tell us what you do.
Well, what would you say you do here? It's a great line from the Office Space, right? And so I get asked that a lot, and folks that don't follow this space, and essentially what ALEC has done, and ALEC has had a long history with some great luminaries here in Iowa, as you know well. Speaker Upmeyer, Terry Branstad, Governor Branstad was one of the ALEC founders back in 1973. Now John Will's on the ALEC board. We work with state legislators across the country to really educate on the principles of limited government, free markets, federalism, and what policies actually matter at the state level, right?
Yeah.
Not all the solutions come from back home in Washington, D.C., and that's a good thing. Yeah.
Did you know that Speaker Upmeyer's dad's desk was next to Terry Branstad's desk in the House chamber?
Incredible.
His first term in the legislature. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. No,
I did not know that.
Yeah. So, she used to tell stories about how messy his desk was when she'd come visit her dad in the legislature. Anyway. So, no, it's great. And Jonathan, you're somebody, I know John's worked with you for many years. I've worked with you for many years and been around the country, but obviously made many trips to Iowa over the years. So we're really excited to have you here in studio today. You wouldn't be in Iowa if there weren't things happening in Iowa. So give us, we like to tell our story a lot. John and I are really good at that.
Yes. Yep.
Not only are we the gold standard conservative podcast here in Iowa, we have a gold standard tax policy over the last few years, but give us your perspective on what's going on in Iowa, or what would you tell somebody from another state if you were on the California podcast about what are they doing in Iowa?
Well, if the California podcast is basically look what they're doing in California and run as fast as you can in the other direction and don't do it. I would say the opposite of that is true in Iowa. Is like, I think one of the things I'm going to talk about tonight when we talk with legislators and our allies around the Capitol for our annual ALEC event is, what are you doing that is doing well? And I think there's so many of those things that Iowa's been at really the forefront, whether it's the tax cuts and tax reform, whether it's education freedom, so many different good free market conservative reforms that Iowa's been a leader at. Continue those things, right? Look at ways to continue that progress. And other states are paying attention. And that's the great thing about the laboratories of democracy concept is, yes, you can get in the lead, and you have been in the lead on so many of these big picture free market conservative issues. But because of the competitive dynamics of the marketplace, you don't stay in the lead unless you continue to move that way. And you can easily fall behind by standing still. And so one of the things is, of course, really continue that progress that you've made. I was just in Topeka, Kansas, as we were talking a little bit before the show last week with Senate President Ty Masterson, who's this year's ALEC National Chairman. Mm-hmm. They're looking at ways to catch up to Iowa. Nebraska, I was in Lincoln a few weeks ago. They're looking at ways to catch up to Iowa. And just because of that dynamic, it's so important to stay ahead, keep that competitive edge going.
And I'd like to hear you speak, too. I think that it's always exciting to hear people talk about how great we are here in Iowa. But why does that competition matter? And what do you that competition between states for lower rates that happens? Like, why do you, from an economist standpoint, and maybe it's the macro trend of why does that matter to an individual state? Why do I care what they're doing in Kansas?
Well, I mean, it matters. This is the crux of our rich states, poor states report for the last
nearly
20 years.
I asked you about rich states, poor states.
Well, and this is the thesis, right? Art Laffer and Steve Moore and I came together my first day at ALEC in 2007, and they had an idea for a publication to say, let's take this concept of 50 laboratories of democracy and why policy matters across state lines, in that taxes matter. We know that, but not all taxes are created equally. So let's look at the things that matter the most for economic growth. Because you answer your question more directly, why does it matter? Do you want to be a growth state, or do you want to be a stagnant state? Do you want to be a state that's an inbound migration state, or a state where people are leaving and saying they were from? My personal story is from Saginaw, Michigan. We're a town of 100,000 people 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Today, we're under 50,000 people. You look at Detroit, you look at Baltimore, you look at the places where people are leaving, what's the common traits there? And then you contrast that to the places that people are going. I mean, that's where we got rich states, poor states from, obviously, other than the playoff of rich dad, poor dad. It's the concept of, do you want to be a state that's booming, that's growing jobs, that's growing income, that's making your lives better off, that has a future for your kids and your grandkids to stay in the community that you grew up in? Or do you want to be a state where people are forced to leave because there's not those opportunities?
I always had this line that I used in my, sort of political stump speech or door knocking or whatever, why are you running for office? And when I first started, it was very little children, and, obviously they're big and now, but I'm doing this because I don't want my children to have to leave to chase their dreams.
Bingo.
That all the opportunities they need are right here in Iowa. And I think that's really at the heart of that, and why it's at a macro level, you're talking about that competition between states. And that's exactly right, because that creates those economic opportunities where the individual can then thrive or the business can thrive. So, yes, when we say you're like-minded, we mean it, right, John?
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Yep. I need to let you. Yeah. I know you've also had a very lengthy pre-production meeting. Mm-hmm. With Jonathan, as I was in here monkeying around with all the technical problems that we have.
I didn't get the tutorial on the headset, so that would have been important.
Right. So usually we have the John Hendrickson and Chris pre-production meeting. We go over the issues of the day. That was abbreviated, and you two took it from there. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to let you. What came out of today's pre-production meeting, John?
I think one thing, I first met Jonathan, it was either 2007 or 2008 at a Hillsdale conference.
That's right.
And so we've been kind of working together since then. But I think one thing I've learned from you and the late Bob Williams was the issue of sound budgeting, conservative budgeting, prudent budgeting. And so could you talk a little bit about that and the importance of sound budgeting in relation to good tax policy?
Well, it's such the crux of the matter, and at the state level, and 49 of the 50 states, as you all know, have a balanced budget requirement of some sort or the other. And, spending is taxation, as Milton Friedman would say, right? And, that's one of the key lessons from rich states, poor states, is to be successful over the long term, to keep tax burdens down and to become a state that is a growth state, because there's the linkage of taxes equal growth, but there's also the linkage of spending equals taxation. So at the end of the day, restraining spending leads to more growth when it comes to overall economic activity. And that's the important thing. It's the heavy lifting, though. And Chris, you know this well, serving in the legislature, is, that's not a lot of times the easiest ground to fight in those trench warfares on, are we going to grow spending by, 5% or 8%, or what are we going to do with public education spending, or all those things?
The easiest thing to do as a politician, if you're on the ballot, is to give somebody more money, to spend more. To go and win votes. That's easy.
And that's why we call them election year budgets, right? For a reason, right? I mean, those numbers have been sky high. And that's actually one of the things that I'm most nervous about right now is the Biden bucks, as we know from the federal level, are drying up. All those federal dollars that are no such thing as a free lunch, by the way, coming to the state level. And those things are going away. And at the same time, states have really grown baseline spending over the last 3 years coming out of the pandemic. In many cases, they didn't learn the mistakes of the Obama bucks from a decade ago, where then they built those into baselines, and now they're going to be held to account by the media or others, whether those are real or assumed baselines. You're going to take away that money from somebody after you've already spent and grown that spending. So, I mean, I think that's going to be some of the big battles that are going out there. To the direct question that you had of how do we tackle this budgeting? And of course, from the ALEC approach, it's always been, how do you reprioritize your spending? Don't go back and ask for more from taxpayers when either the federal support runs dry or revenues start to run flat. But do what any family or small business does, and they sit around a table, something like this today, maybe not as fancy of a setup as you all have, but at the kitchen table and say, what's a need versus a want, and how do we make sure that we reprioritize?
Right. No, that's well said. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that you two have compared notes in the past. So it's right. And we have really hammered on that budget side of things lately, is to remind them that legislators and other policymakers, that you control both sides of the ledger. And if they're concerned about out years, just remember that you do control the budget side of that as well. So,
yeah, and I think we're joking about California, but I think of our neighbors to the north in Minnesota that are doing the direct opposite of Iowa. For example, Governor Walz has spent record amounts. I mean, they just last year they blew their surplus in spending enormous fiscal year budget, and they're continuing that spending, and also they're advancing a universal basic income, and we're trying to ban it here in Iowa. So I think that's going to come back and haunt them, and people are leaving Minnesota.
Well, that's the thing, and that's somewhat of a new phenomenon too, in that the Twin Cities dynamic with so many of the big corporations that have been located there for decades had kept growth somewhat constant in that area. Now we're seeing that go away, and that was actually one of the really sad things coming out of this last budget, is even though Minnesota had the surplus, they blew through it, to your point, John, and then they actually raised taxes on the business community in a surplus environment. And so, I mean, think pretty quickly about both Illinois and Minnesota becoming the Californias of the Midwest without the good weather, right? And driving the residents away. Illinois has lost hundreds of thousands. They've been one of the biggest out-migration states, as you know well. Iowa's benefited from that, I think, pretty directly, especially in the Quad City area. But, I mean, looking at Minnesota, they're not many years behind, I think, where Illinois has been.
Yeah. One other question I have for you, and there's a lot of debate over the benefits of a flat tax, and there are a lot of progressive critics will say, well, the flat tax isn't fair, which we disagree with. But could you talk a little bit about the benefits of a flat tax, of a low flat tax? And I mean, obviously, we'd like to see something progress to eliminate the income tax, but just, I guess, from a low perspective of flat tax, what are some of the benefits of that?
Well, I mean, there's so many. I mean, we've sung the praises of what you all and Governor Reynolds and the legislature have done here in Iowa to be a real leader in this state flat tax revolution that we've seen, with 4 states following Iowa's lead on that in 2022, something that we hadn't seen in the history of state income taxes. That many states go to a single rate personal income tax. And the reason why is fairly clear. I mean, Steve Forbes laid it out well in the 1990s, and while it stalled in Congress, we saw the states take up the banner of that because it basically does away with the disincentive to work, save, and invest in a particular state. It doesn't allow for the income redistribution game that the progressives like to play in the tax code of picking winners and losers and taxing the rich. And at the end of the day, taxing the rich means losing the rich, as we find with the migration patterns in rich states, poor states. And so, if you raise a tax and say you're soaking a rich person, or by the way, the vast majority of small businesses pay on the individual side of the code, as you know, so it plays out as taxing small businesses. You try to raise taxes on them, what's their income level times 0, because that's what you're going to get when they move to another state. So I think people have learned the lessons of California on the most progressive system in the country, seeing the millions of people that now have voted with their feet and left California in the nicest weather, by the way, on earth.
Yes.
And going to a state like Texas that, summers aren't enviable in Texas when you're compared and used to California weather. So I think the proof is in the pudding. The flat tax states are some of the fastest growing states in the country. They're states that have, I think, been fiscally governed. And at the end of the day, I think it's something that state legislators have within their control to fight back against the big government agenda coming from the Biden administration, the inflation that we're seeing coming out at the federal level. And there's something that they can do to try to make people's lives better off to mitigate some of those effects.
Yeah, I'd agree. And the other thing that we're looking at in Iowa is 2 taxpayer protection amendments. One would have a 2/3 majority requirement in both houses of the legislature to increase taxes, and the other one would constitutionally protect the flat tax. Do you think those are good ideas?
I mean, I think from a policy perspective, they're very strong. I mean, they're something that, in a way, at ALEC have looked at, as you know, from the tax and expenditure limitation, agenda from the Colorado Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is about the strongest, to supermajority requirements for tax increases. And they're actually things that go into the score for when we rank a state in rich states, poor states, to get your economic outlook score. That will be one of the factors we look at. So that will improve Iowa's ranking in rich states, poor states. Obviously, you're going to improve because of the flat tax as it's phased in. We're big fans of it, like I said. In fact, as you know, we have Governor Reynolds on the cover of Rich States, Poor States this year, who wrote the foreword to the book. So we think what you did is exactly right, and you were the leaders in this flat tax revolution.
We can almost literally say that Governor Reynolds wrote the book on tax policy.
Yes, yeah.
Well, we won't take that away because it's still got your name on it.
And by the way, though, I mean, I think, it was so important that, and I've told this story in now 50 states as we've gone out to do events since she's done that, but it was juxtaposing that versus what the Biden administration had laid out, and her being able to go on national TV, and I thought did an incredible job in that response to the President's State of the Union to say, all right, here's the big government way of doing things in Washington, and here's the common sense Midwestern way of doing things in Iowa. I couldn't have been prouder as the governor is an ALEC alum. It was just such a great thing to see.
Yeah. No, we are eager. Look, we're not necessarily wishing the days away, but we're eager for the day 5-10 years down the road or more, when we look at the impact of what we've done over the past few years, compare it to Minnesota, compare it to other states, just compare it to ourselves and how much stronger we are, because we think we're going to have an incredible story to tell of where we came from and where we'll go. So backing up just a little bit on Rich States, Poor States. So that's an annual publication that you guys, I think predominantly are in charge of that project or author it. But I guess we should have started at the front of that, but what is it and what are you trying to capture in that?
Yeah, so it's a collaborative project with Art Laffer and Steve Moore. And, every year we look at ranking the states based on their economic outlook. So we have picked out 15 different things that we pick out. And essentially what we're trying to measure is how well positioned a state is to grow in the future. Because you could look at a lot of things that are stale, backwards looking things that are important to chart, where you've come from as a state. But I think more importantly, what we're trying to do is, take the policy levers that legislators can directly control and that they look at and they can vote on in a given year in a state legislative chamber, and then see what is it going to mean and how do we move our state forward? Because, you can look at probably, and John's looked at all these metrics too as a researcher, to say, what are the things that matter for why some states grow and some fall behind? And that's the whole concept. And, what we focused on are just 15. So you could say, hey, you could measure 1,000. You guys maybe oversimplify. But we think of all the things that matter, things like tax rates, tax burdens, labor policies, regulations, things that, matter, and things that directly legislators control. It's so important because there's so many of these different rankings, as you know, out there, whether it's CNBC or others that don't even publish in many times their methodology of how they come up with it. But focusing for state legislators, what can you do to really improve your state going forward? And that's what Rich States, Poor States is all about.
I know. I remember we Rich States, Poor States is out. Flip through it, see where you rank and what I mean, you'd actually look at these things. It's a scorecard. You find it's like getting your legislative report card and find out how you did and what you can do better on it.
Utah has been the top dog, hasn't it?
Utah's been number one for all 16 editions of Rich States, Poor States.
Is there any state that's may overtake them anytime soon, do you think? Or?
There's some that are nipping on the heels and working with Utah legislators. They're very cognizant of that fact, and they're always looking to stay ahead. And one of the great things about Utah, and we could probably spend a whole episode talking about Utah and its track record over 16 years, but one of the things they do is they're always looking ahead to see what can we do to keep moving forward, and they're always looking behind them to see who's coming up behind that actually may have a chance to catch them. And right now it's Arizona, it's Idaho, it's North Carolina, and states like that have moved up in many cases tremendously. North Carolina 10 years ago was number 26, I think, because of dedication to tax reform and doing, in a way, what you all are doing and undertaking right now to go to a flat tax, what North Carolina did a decade ago, and so many other things that have moved that state from middle of the pack to now in perennially the top 5. Both looking at states like that have moved up and then looking at Utah. Lots of great stories out there to tell.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit on something that you touched on. And so getting a little bit more into the technical side of things, but what has been the impact of Bidenomics, Biden's economy, the Biden bucks, inflation on state level tax policy? And I'm coming at that from a couple of angles. Is obviously many states have seen a lot of extra dollars coming through the system, but it also just changes the dynamics of this. So what has been the impact of all that?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of different impacts, and one is, times have never been so flush with cash, right? I mean, yeah, you look back at your time in the legislature, you probably, could have, loved to see this kind of surplus money that's been sitting around the last few years. On the other hand, as fiscal conservatives, having these surpluses can be some of the most dangerous times in terms of growing government spending. And getting back to John's question about, setting up this balanced budget environment for the future to make sure we have responsible spending growth. So, I mean, that's been one aspect is, legislators in many cases have not been forced to choose between needs and wants. Mm-hmm. And so what we've seen is a very different dynamic coming out of the pandemic with both reopening of the economies and that kind of the natural comeback to the demand side of spending from a consumer spending perspective. Consumers had obviously a lot of federal funds in their bank accounts that they had been spending down, and now going into debt, as it looks like, continuing the spending spree from the consumer side. And then also you have the side of it of inflation eating away people's disposable income. That I just saw some statistics from Steve Moore's morning hotline, talking about how, yes, personal incomes are up during the Biden administration, but on net, when you take into effect the effects of inflation, we're actually seeing reduction in take-home wages when you look at the inflation effects, where during the Trump years, you saw a nice increase in wages without the massive inflation. And so I think you've seen states trying to counterbalance what's happening at the federal level and provide relief like we were just talking about. And they actually have the money there sitting to provide the relief. Yeah. Now, the question is, can it be more than one time? Because a lot of states took the approach of sending rebates out to individuals and having the one-time effect, which is fine because they're not spending the money and you're giving it back to taxpayers, but it doesn't provide the supply-side incentive effect to have businesses and individuals continue to invest and do business in your state. It's a one-time hit, and it's better than spending the money, but it's not the kind of long-time, I think, tax reform that we'd like to see.
Could you, I don't want to imitate Ben Stein, but can you explain supply-side economics? For our listeners.
Bueller. So supply side economics essentially is getting to the incentive effects that we were just talking about, right? Instead of giving somebody a rebate check, then they can go out and spend. And yes, that's going to have an effect in the economy because it's going to change demand and consumption, and then people are going to benefit from that. And it obviously does then trickle through the economic. It's a little bit of a play on trickle down there on the economic plans. But I mean, trickle down happens whether you're looking at demand side or supply side. The chances, of having a one-time hit like we were just talking about with the rebate versus a supply side incentive effect where you're actually going to have long-term incentives in place for individuals. And importantly, from a supply side perspective, as you know, John, businesses making investment decisions, then they're going to have long-term effects. I mean, that's actually, the heart of it. I mean, this was Reaganomics, and not just changing, a tax policy for a year, but changing the course of American history by becoming a nation that had not some of the highest tax rates in the world, but actually went to from 78% marginal rate when President Reagan took office to 28% by the time H.W. Bush was president, unlocking a huge supply side of investing. And what we saw, of course, was a 2-decade boom that lasted up until the 9/11 downturn.
Yeah. Do you think, in terms of predictions, will we see the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act be made permanent or even extended, or will those rates go up? And will that, what kind of harm do you think that would have on the economy if those rates are, if those rates go up? Because I know it'll be a substantial tax increase for most taxpayers.
Well, I'm glad you asked about this. This is something that we at ALEC have thought and done a lot of work about in the last year or two here, especially because as most things in Washington, it comes to an end, right? All good things come to an end in Washington. And that is no exception with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which really, as you know, is the first remake of the federal tax code in more than 30 years under President Trump, and led to a whole a slew of different changes, whether the corporate side that took the United States from being one of the highest tax nations in the world to basically average in the OECD countries. But then importantly, from the individual side, I think it was more than 30 individual provisions changed, including probably most popularly the child care tax credit was expanded dramatically. You saw the standard deduction be doubled roughly, and then you saw the effects of the lower marginal rates from a supply side perspective on small businesses and individuals. And the threat, of course, under Senate rules, and just not to get too wonky with the Senate rules in Washington, D.C.
We fashion ourselves as expert parliamentarians around here.
Well, you're going to love this.
Yeah, no, let's go.
Most people, when I say this, their eyes glaze over within about 10 seconds.
Our listeners started
Senate
that at
rules.
the front end when we were talking about tax policy. After we got into putting the headphones on, they kind of checked out. But let's go.
So what happens in the Senate is, budget reconciliation. That's how things pass unless you have 60 votes. Lately in our history, we haven't had 60 votes one way or the other. So all tax bills generally happen with a budget reconciliation, which then puts a phase out on it. So essentially the 2017 tax cuts will be phased out by the end of 2025 if nothing is done. So to your point, I don't think that we're going to see in this Congress any agreement on it. I think we can hope that after the 2024 elections here, regardless of party affiliation, you're going to have different set of characters that are going to actually want to renew the tax cuts. Because if nothing is done, it's a $1.5 trillion tax cut that's going to go away, the vast majority of that individual side. And so if you look at the president's new budget that he just rolled out, the fiscal year 2025 budget, it assumes that those tax cuts go away. He'd like to talk publicly about how he's not going to have a tax increase on the middle class or small businesses. But folks, he's assuming that those tax cuts go away, and he's going to spend that extra money in the budget proposal. So, once again, talk versus reality here. You have to follow the numbers.
My perspective, and this is getting more into the politics side of it, I think Americans instinctively get it. They get that Joe Biden and the progressives and the Democrats, they want higher taxes, more spending. And so they can try and spin this all the way. John and I were talking about immigration and the border the other day, and now you see the Biden administration starting to try and blame Republicans in Congress for not. You're where you're at. The American people get it. I mean, there are certain things you can spin and get away with it. The Democrats' record on tax and spending is pretty clear, and I think folks get it. So,
well, one thing that's a little bit under the radar on this whole debate about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is a couple of things that were a little under the surface for most folks. That happened as part of that were the unlimited state and local tax deduction, the SALT deduction, which essentially was a subsidy for New York, Illinois, California, and high tax states to have all of us from lower tax states subsidize those states in their tax bills. That was unlimited pre-Trump tax cuts. That got changed to a $10,000 individual cap. So that would go back to being unlimited if that tax cut goes away. And the other thing that, is I think really interesting of this is you have the effect of state budgets. So one of the, I think, underappreciated elements of the Trump tax cuts is it led to state budget surpluses because of the linkage of state codes to the federal tax code. And essentially what the Trump tax cuts did was broaden the federal tax base. So states almost all linked to the federal tax base as a starting point, some automatically, some by vote of the legislature. And so by definition, in many cases, state tax bases became broader. And then you saw that unforeseen tax surplus revenue. What would you get it? You saw that go away. You would see at the very time that revenues are softening and the federal stimulus dollars are going away or aid to the states, you would see that happen. That would be catastrophic, I think, for state budgets.
That's a really interesting point that I think we haven't really spent a lot of time on because mostly we just want our tax cuts.
And it's real wonky stuff.
It is. It is. But you got to really walk through it. So that's good. Okay. And I guess I want to ask this, and maybe you've already touched on this, but so a state like Iowa, because that's where we are, is running this big structural surplus. We've built up, stockpiled a lot of cash over the years just because we're collecting more than we need. The left, the opponents to tax reform, continue to beat the drum that the only reason we have those surpluses is because of federal stimulus payments to the states. Can you debunk that? Because, I mean, I don't know how many more times I can say it's just ongoing revenue is what shows up in those revenue projections, but maybe you can take a different stab at it from another direction.
No, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's hard to to, in some degrees, sparse it out at this point. I mean, but, we know that as the Biden dollars run out, we're still going to see natural rates of growth in income tax collections and sales tax collections that are going to be elevated from pandemic or pre-pandemic levels. And so I think you look at the numbers, it's part federal funds, but those things are already starting to go away. And that it's states ongoing as well. And so you look at it from a perspective of, all right, so now the money's sitting there. What do you do with it? Obviously, you don't want to spend it all in one fell swoop. But tax cuts aren't spending either. And so looking at ways to make sure that you reinvest those from a taxpayer's perspective to make sure that Iowa gets the biggest bang for the buck. I mean, I think that's the big question that not just Iowa's working on right now, but states all across the country.
Oh, that's right. John?
No, I would agree with that. And I want to just touch on one more issue, and that's what we were talking about before we came in, and that was just the importance of federalism. And you were sharing the story about the contract with America and Newt Gingrich and how some Republican governors launched welfare reform and how that led to such a major reform at the federal level. Could you share that story with our listeners?
Speaker Gingrich has been such a great friend of ALEC's. I know a great friend of Speaker Upmeyer has come out here many times.
Oh, Newt's great.
And just phenomenal. And, he oftentimes tells the story of the contract with America, and just an incredible story when you think about it, with Republicans and conservatives taking back Congress for the first time in decades. And, I always am struck by that because, as we talk with legislators now, and let's say they're in a state that, needs to be a different, majority at some point and get away from progressive ideas to more conservative ideas. And, you look at Newt as an inspiration of how did you guys do it? And, they look at it and they chose those issues that were the 70% or 80% issues that resonated with average hardworking taxpayers across the country, but were also conservative priorities. But to his credit, his Speaker Gingrich went and said, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here at the federal level. We have 50 laboratories of democracy, taking from this, ALEC playbook, taking from things that Governor Branstad did back home in my home state of Michigan, Governor Engler, and in Wisconsin, Governor Tommy Thompson, all three of whom were early members of ALEC when they served in their state legislative capacities. And you look at those things like welfare reform, right? I mean, welfare reform, according to Speaker Gingrich, would have never happened at the federal level if pioneering states from the Midwest didn't start on that idea, right? I mean, it's incredible to think where we had visionary leaders like that weren't absorbed with themselves out of the federal ideas, that all ideas must come from Washington, D.C., like sometimes we get today, and actually looking to the states to say, federalism actually works, and that's one of the things from an educational basis. ALEC is, a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization. We just put out a new report talking about federalism and the roles of that, because so many new legislators, you see it here in Iowa, you see it in so many other states, what's the proper balance of government from federal and state and local? And one of the great things that a lot of folks forget is, Reagan always would say it wasn't the federal government that created states, it was the states that created the federal government. And by the way, the states as the sovereigns also created local units of government. Right. And so the true power rests in state capitals. And that's an important distinction. Local control, it can be a good thing. It is oftentimes used as a campaign slogan, but at the same time, it has to be that proper balance, and the checks and balances are important things that the founders gave us.
Absolutely.
Yay, federalism. Yeah. Our listeners are going to have to listen to me say it again, John, because I've been a broken record. But when it comes to local control around here, that's something I have beat the drum on over and over. The proponents of local control never claim that in an effort to cut my taxes or to make me more free. It is always spoken of in efforts to tax me more and to take away more of my liberty.
Yeah,
every time.
That's right. That's how it plays out.
And it needs to be understood in that context. So with that, once again, guys, I'm sorry I had to bring it up again, but I don't think Jonathan's ever heard me go on that rant.
But you're not going to get complaints from this corner.
Yeah. Right, good. Well, no, and look, we've lamented federalism is so important. And yet it's another one of those things I think the average person sort of glazes over on because they don't understand what you just talked about, is how important that is. And the reason it's important is, well, the whole idea of not having a 50-state size solution, but because you're in state capitals all the time. And John knows, he's worked in multiple state capitals now. And from my time as a legislator, you can go right now. They're in session as we're recording this, and you can walk up to the front door of the Iowa House of Representatives or the Iowa Senate, send in a note, and most of the time, unless they're really tied up, you can speak to your legislator and tell them what your issue is, and they will respond to you, or you can call them or email them. And I mean, it's representative democracy, and more people will show up for that than they will at their local city council meeting. And it's the way it ought to work. Maybe it's not that way in California. It probably works more like Congress there, but it's wonderful.
And they got a lot of the same problems as Congress.
Well, yeah,
you notice that
figure. Yeah. But you want that. Look, and I know my congressman is Zach Nunn, and I know Zach, and if I wanted to call him or text him, I'd probably get a response. But even then, if I really had an issue, I probably have to, wanted to come to my event or something. I got to go through this whole deal to talk to my member of Congress. It's just much more representative at the state level, and they're going to understand those particular needs of the communities they represent. It's the way it ought to work.
Yep.
And so I say all of that because I've always, maybe above all else that ALEC does, understands that and is so focused on just those core principles of federalism. And I just wish there were easier ways to communicate those concepts to Americans, because I think they're conceptually and philosophically with us on that. It's just sometimes hard to explain what it is and why it matters to them.
Yeah, a lot of times, and I know this from experience, it's not taught anymore.
Yeah,
in classrooms.
Well, I was actually going to say the exact same thing. There is, this is why literacy from a civics perspective, financial literacy is so important being taught, is that, folks don't realize the underpinnings of what is it that makes America different, right? What is about the American Constitution, about this system of federalism that's awfully rare when you look around the countries around the world. I mean, Switzerland has a degree of federalism that's pretty, interesting, but outside of Switzerland and the United States, it's very rare to have that type of autonomy among, subnational entities like we do.
Yeah,
I mean, and that's a huge feature. But back on your point, Chris, on as we're talking to legislators across the country from an ALEC perspective, what you just said is so important, because our ALEC legislators want to hear from their constituents. They're not walled off through multiple staff levels that are going to keep the gatekeepers to keep their constituents away from them. They actually want to have those interactions at the coffee shops when they're back in their districts on the weekend, or to your point, folks coming up to the Capitol and wanting to have a quick chat about an issue. That's something that's, I think it's an upside. But one other thing I'll say is there, so many people, the only time they think to reach out to an elected official, I know you'll appreciate this, is when they have a beef with them.
Right.
It's awfully important, folks, when you're watching and seeing what your legislator's doing, whether it's trying to make a flat tax or school choice or supermajority requirement for tax increases or any of these big conservative free market reforms, tell them how much of it you think is a good idea too, because that's such a big deal as folks are getting burnt out, getting beat up all the time. Half the time people confuse them for the bad ideas of going on in Washington, D.C. Let the good folks know the good work they're doing as well.
I think that is an incredibly important point. And I think we as conservatives often are frustrated at things that are going on as we speak out about them. But it's difficult to be an elected official at any level, especially at the state level. And, if it's only criticism, we need to encourage the good folks to stay involved in the fight, because it is difficult.
I even received criticism as a member of the library board.
Yeah, it's true.
I did. There was a disgruntled person that cut up their library card and sent pieces to each of the board members. Yeah, yeah.
I'll bet that individual's a joy to deal with at the city council meeting and when they make the trip to the state capitol. Okay. We are way over time for what we usually allot for the podcast, but I knew it, John. John's always got one more issue.
Yeah. I'm like Columbo, just one more thing.
One more. What do you got, John?
I wanted to apologize to you and to our audience on YouTube because I forgot Herbert Hoover again. Yeah.
So we had a mascot for a year, which was a gnome, patriotic gnome, that was the traveling gift at my church's trivia night every year. And we lost. So the gnome didn't get to come back with us. And so then we had a Herbert Hoover bobblehead, which John continues to forget to bring in. So here we are, no mascot, just us and a plain white conference table. And it's just, it's difficult.
I'm absent-minded and I forget.
The absent-minded professor. I'm going to close with this because you talked about Newt Gingrich and the Contract for America America and 70% issues. Well, the one I'm going to mention was the Des Moines Register had their Iowa poll recently, which is they at least call themselves the gold standard in polling. I think it's the ITR Foundation poll, but we'll set that as issue aside for a minute. They asked, do you favor the gradual elimination of Iowa's individual income tax? And that was a 60% support. So the message being to legislators, and I think this is true in many states, maybe not the deepest of blue states, but is that the people want to have their tax burden reduced. I believe when you see numbers like that the people understand that they are overtaxed and want relief. And I maybe close with a thought on that.
Well, I'm so glad you brought it up, because I saw that in the news as part of my reading of interesting things around state capitals, and several people sent it to me as well. And I thought that was great, because so much of the fear-mongering that happens around cutting taxes or eliminating taxes, or you're going to lose services or other things. But that's actually one of the most key lessons from rich states, poor states, is all taxes matter for economic growth and prosperity of a state or as individuals, but not all taxes are created equally. And income taxes are the most damaging dollar for dollar of any way that states raise revenue. Mm-hmm. And if you look at, once again, don't take free market economist Jonathan Williams' word for it here. The proof is in the pudding. Look at the 9 states that do not tax personal income, led by Texas and Florida, 2 of the fastest growing states in America, growing tremendously by hundreds of thousands of individuals over the last year alone. Contrast those with the states with the highest income tax, and what's working is it's a huge inhibitor to growth on the high income tax states, and it's a huge benefit to growth being a no income tax state. To just say, when you come and earn $1 in this state, yes, you're going to pay your federal income tax, but you're not going to pay anything else at that point. And you're competing against states all across the country. That's an important element as a differentiation factor. As you have your economic development people looking to sell Iowa, to say coming into Iowa to do business, that is the number one thing that they could use as billboards around the country to say Iowa is an income tax-free state. Incredible opportunity.
Yep. It's not just handouts and tax credits, John.
That's right, yeah.
Income tax rates matter too.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
The bottom line, 16 years of rich states, poor states, traveling the 50 states multiple times over. Be more like Texas and Florida and less like California and New York.
All right. Yeah. And we are going to work so that when you say that in the future, it'll be more like Texas and Florida and Iowa. That's our goal right here, right?
Bring your lips to God's ears.
That's right. All right. Well, Jonathan, thank you. This was a lot of fun. Even more fun than the pre-production meeting. I had a blast. You are always welcome back on the ITR Live podcast. I hope it was worth your time. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
And on behalf of John Hendrickson, we thank you for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Join us on whatever your preferred audio or video platform is. And with all of that said, we will see you next time on ITR Live.